The year was 1876, and the autumn that settled over the high plains of Wyoming was not a season of gentle decline, but a stark and brutal harbinger. The town of Providence Creek, a small collection of 57 souls huddled against the vast, unforgiving landscape, felt the change in the marrow of their bones. The winds came earlier than any living resident could recall, carrying not the scent of pine and dry earth, but the sterile, metallic tang of deep-seated frost. By October, the creek that gave the town its name had frozen solid to its bed, and the aspens on the surrounding hillsides had not turned gold, but a sickly, brittle brown before shedding their leaves in a single, desperate surrender. Winter was not coming. It was already here, crouching just beyond the horizon, gathering its strength for a pounce that all feared would be lethal. Her name was Alara Vance. She was 19 years old, a widow for 2 of them, and an orphan for 17. Her husband, a young and hopeful prospector named Thomas, had been taken by a rock slide in the Bighorn Mountains, leaving her with little more than his name, a small plot of land on the edge of town, and a quiet resilience that the townsfolk often mistook for aloofness or even arrogance. She was an outsider not by choice, but by the cruel arithmetic of fate. She lived alone in a small, poorly constructed cabin that Thomas had hastily erected, a structure that now seemed less a home and more a sieve for the relentless, keening wind. Her woodpile, though meticulously stacked, was a monument to inadequacy against the coming cold. On the evening of November 3rd, 1876, the town's leading men gathered in the cramped, smoky confines of the general store, which doubled as their meeting hall. Mayor Thompson, a man whose authority was derived more from the size of his land holdings than any innate wisdom, called the meeting to order. Beside him sat Silas Croft, the owner of the store and the town's de facto banker, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on a stack of unpaid ledgers. And in the corner, holding a worn Bible, was Elder Finch, whose sermons increasingly focused on divine punishment and the sins of a fallen world. The air was thick with the scent of pipe smoke, kerosene, and a palpable, collective fear. Their plan, as it was laid out by the mayor, was one of grim necessity and blind faith. Wood would be strictly rationed. Each family would receive an allotment calculated to last until April, provided they burned it with impossible efficiency. Food supplies would be pooled and distributed under the watchful eye of Silas Croft, ensuring no family took more than its share. And Elder Finch would lead nightly prayers for deliverance, for a miraculous reprieve from the inevitable. It was a plan born of desperation, a strategy of shared suffering that offered no real solution, only a communal path to a slow, cold demise. It was then that Alara Vance spoke. She had stood silently at the back of the room, a slight figure wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her presence barely tolerated. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the murmuring assent with a startling clarity. "That will not be enough," she said. The men turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and irritation. "The wood will be gone by February," she continued, her gaze steady. "The wind will steal the heat from our homes faster than we can generate it. We are fighting the cold on its terms, in structures that are designed to fail." Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, a condescending smile touching his lips. "And what, Mistress Vance, would you propose we do? Grow wings and fly south with the geese?" A few of the men chuckled, the sound hollow and strained. Alara ignored the jibe. "My grandfather was a trapper in the Northern Territories. He learned from the Ute and the Shoshone. He did not fight the winter. He used the earth to shield himself from it. He taught me how to build a shelter that holds its warmth not for hours, but for days." She stepped forward, her youthful face earnest in the flickering lamplight. "We must dig," she explained, "into the south-facing slope of Miller's Ridge. The earth itself is an insulator. A dugout, properly constructed, with a deep cold sink at the entrance and a flue for ventilation, can maintain a livable temperature with a fire a fraction of the size we use now. The ground's thermal mass absorbs heat and radiates it back slowly. It is a principle of thermodynamics. The men stared at her blankly. The word thermodynamics was a foreign, almost profane sound in this room of practical, unlettered men. Silas Croft scoffed, his ledger forgotten. A cave? You are suggesting we abandon our homes and live like animals in a hole in the ground? That is a primitive and foolish notion. We are civilized people, not badgers. Elder Finch nodded in solemn agreement. It is an act of profound faithlessness, he intoned, his voice resonating with practiced piety. To turn our backs on the homes God has provided and burrow into the dirt is to question his providence. We must put our trust in the Lord, not in pagan tricks learned from savages. The dismissal was absolute. Her idea was not debated. It was ridiculed. They saw a young, grieving woman, perhaps unhinged by loneliness, proposing a desperate and undignified solution. They saw a girl, not a sage. They saw dirt and filth, not physics and thermal mass. Not one of them had lost a family member to the unforgiving cold of a poorly built cabin. Not one had spent weeks patching chinking with mud and moss, only to feel the icy fingers of a draft steal their warmth as they slept. And not one, in their pride and their fear, would admit that a 19-year-old widow might possess a wisdom they sorely lacked. Mayor Thompson ended the discussion with a final, patronizing pat on the air in her direction. Thank you for your concern, Mistress Vance, but we will stick to a more sensible path. Alara looked at their faces, at the wall of certainty and condescension, and knew that she was utterly alone. She gave a single, sharp nod, turned, and walked out into the biting wind, the men's smug pronouncements echoing behind her. Her path was no longer sensible. It was necessary. The next morning, November 4th, Alara began her work. She did not own a horse or a mule, so she carried her tools the half-mile to the base of Miller's Ridge on her own back. A heavy pickaxe with a worn handle, a broad-headed shovel, and a rickety wheelbarrow that squealed in protest with every turn of its axle. The total value of her assets, beyond the clothes she wore and the small cabin, amounted to $47 in silver coins, saved from the meager sums Thomas had sent back from the mountains. She spent 27 of those dollars at Silas Croft's store on items she could not improvise: a box of sturdy nails, a small handsaw, 2 thick wool blankets, and a large sack of flour. Croft had smirked as he counted her money, a look that said he was profiting from her folly. She selected her site with a care that bordered on reverence, following the lessons her grandfather had imparted years ago. It had to be a south-facing slope to catch the maximum benefit of the low winter sun. The ground could not be too rocky lest the digging prove impossible, nor too sandy lest it collapse. She spent the entire morning walking the length of the ridge, crumbling soil between her fingers, studying the sparse vegetation, and listening to the way the wind moved over the contours of the land. Finally, she found it. A section of hillside with a gentle, stable grade, composed of a dense mixture of clay and loam, with just enough embedded stone to promise structural integrity. She marked out her dimensions with sharp stones, scratching a rectangle into the frosty ground. It would be 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep. The work of excavation was a brutal, relentless assault on both the earth and her own body. The topsoil was frozen solid, a crust of iron-hard dirt that shattered into icy shards under the blows of her pickaxe. For 2 days, she did nothing but break this frozen layer, her progress measured in inches. Her hands, covered in thin leather gloves, were raw and bleeding by the end of each day. Her back and shoulders screamed with a pain so intense it left her breathless. Each night, she would return to her frigid cabin, consume a meager meal of bread and salted pork, and collapse into a sleep that was less a rest and more a temporary cessation of agony. The townsfolk who passed on the distant trail saw her toiling, a small, solitary figure chipping away at a frozen hill, and they shook their heads in pity and disdain. They saw madness. They did not see the methodical application of ancient, life-saving knowledge. Once she broke through the frost layer, the digging became easier, but the labor only intensified. The soil beneath was dense and heavy. Each swing of the pickaxe loosened a cascade of earth, which she then had to shovel into the wheelbarrow. The journey to dump the excavated soil was a short but torturous one. A downhill push and an uphill, empty return that she repeated hundreds of times a day. She established a rhythm, a grim choreography of effort. Swing, scrape, lift, push, dump, return. The sun would rise, trace its low arc across the pale sky, and set, and she would still be there, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate, but never ceasing. She was carving a space for life out of the inanimate heart of the world. As the hole deepened, transforming from a shallow pit into a recognizable cavity, she began the critical work of shoring up the entrance. She could not afford new lumber, so she scavenged. From the woods behind her cabin, she dragged fallen logs, some half-rotten, but with cores of solid, seasoned pine. Using her small handsaw and an axe, she squared them off as best she could, creating a series of rough-hewn posts and a thick lintel. It took her 4 days to construct the timbered frame for the entrance, a heavy, robust structure that would bear the immense weight of the earth above it. She set the vertical posts deep into the ground and wrestled the massive lintel into place, using a crude lever system of rocks and a sturdy branch. The final act was hammering long, thick planks across the top, creating a short, reinforced tunnel that led into the main chamber. The sound of her hammer echoed in the cold, still air, a lonely counterpoint to the town's collective prayers. By December 1st, the main chamber was complete. It was a space of raw, earthen beauty, the walls a stratified tapestry of clay, sand, and stone. The ceiling was a gentle arch, a shape she had carefully carved to distribute the overhead pressure. It stood 8 feet high at its center, allowing her to walk comfortably without stooping. The air inside was still and cool, but noticeably warmer than the biting wind outside. The earth had already begun its work, insulating her from the worst of the elements. Standing in the center of the silent, subterranean space, she felt not the claustrophobia of a tomb, but the profound security of a womb. Her next task was the most technical, the creation of the ventilation and heating systems. First, she addressed the smoke. A simple fire in an enclosed space would be a death sentence. She needed a chimney, a flue that would draw smoke up and out, while also pulling fresh air into the dwelling. Starting from the rear of the chamber, she began to carefully carve a narrow shaft, no more than 8 inches in diameter, straight up through the remaining 20 feet of earth above her. It was painstaking work, done with a small trowel and a long stick to clear debris. When she finally broke through to the surface, a small circle of pale light illuminated the dusty air, a moment of quiet triumph. To ensure the flue was fireproof and would not collapse, she prepared a special clay mortar, mixing the dense clay from the excavation with water and dried grasses. She spent a day plastering the inside of the shaft, her arms submerged deep in the earthen tube, creating a smooth, hardened lining. Next, And just as crucial was the cold sink. This was the cleverest part of her grandfather's design, a simple manipulation of physics that most builders ignored. Just inside the main entrance, she excavated a narrow trench, about 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep, that ran the full 12-foot width of the entrance. Cold air is denser and heavier than warm air. As it entered through the doorway, it would fall into this trench and become trapped, preventing it from flowing into the main living space. The warmer, lighter air from the fire and her own body heat would remain in the upper portion of the chamber, creating a stable, stratified environment. She built a simple wooden grate to cover the trench, allowing her to walk over it safely. It was an invisible, silent machine for managing temperature. The final stage of construction was focused on making the space livable. She used the same clay mortar from the flue to plaster the interior walls and ceiling. This was not merely for aesthetics. The smooth, hard surface would prevent loose dirt from falling and would also help in reflecting the light and heat from her small fire pit. She built the fire pit itself with stones, lining it with a thick layer of her fireproof clay. She positioned it near the center of the room, allowing its radiant heat to warm the space evenly. For a door, she used one of the thick wool blankets she had purchased, but she reinforced it by sandwiching it between 2 layers of scavenged planks, stuffing the gaps with dried moss and grass for insulation. It was heavy and crude, but it fit the timbered entrance snugly, sealing her shelter from the outside world. Her last days of preparation, as December deepened and the sky took on a permanent, ominous gray hue, were spent moving her meager possessions. She transported her small stockpile of firewood, her sacks of flour and beans, her salted meat, and her few personal effects from the cabin to the dugout. Each trip with the squealing wheelbarrow was a testament to her singular, unwavering focus. The townsfolk watched her dismantle her old life. They saw her carrying her small cot, her cooking pot, her grandfather's worn books. To them, it was the final act of a woman who had succumbed to madness. Mayor Thompson, riding past on his horse, had stopped and called out to her. "Mistress Vance, there is still time to reconsider this folly. There is shelter to be had in town with one of the families. Do not consign yourself to this grave." Ilara had simply looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable, and said nothing. She turned and pushed her wheelbarrow into the darkness of her new home. On December 18th, 1876, the world fell silent. The wind, which had been a constant, howling companion for weeks, suddenly ceased. The sky, which had been a uniform sheet of gray, began to darken with an unnatural, bruised purple tinge. The air grew so cold it felt sharp, a physical presence that hurt to breathe. Ilara, standing at the entrance to her dugout, saw the signs her grandfather had described. The squirrels had vanished. The hardy winter birds were nowhere to be seen. A strange, heavy stillness had settled over the land, the deep breath before the scream. She checked her supplies one last time. Firewood stacked neatly against one wall, enough for weeks of small, efficient fires. Water stored in 2 barrels, collected from the last trickle of a nearby spring before it froze. Food secured in a small, cooler alcove she had carved into the rear wall. Everything was in its place. She rolled a large stone against the outside of her heavy, insulated door, went inside, and sealed herself in. The blizzard, which would later be known as the Great White Death of '76, did not arrive gently. It struck Providence Creek like a physical blow. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar as a wall of wind and snow descended from the north, an avalanche of frozen fury that erased the world in an instant. The temperature plummeted from an already frigid 10 degrees Fahrenheit to a lethal negative 40 degrees in the space of 3 hours. The wind, measured in later years by survivors who compared it to hurricanes, gusted to over 80 miles per hour, driving snow with the force of sandblasted glass. It was not a storm, it was a geological event, a liquid nitrogen-fueled scouring of the landscape. Inside her shelter, Alara felt more than heard the storm's arrival. The ground around her transmitted the deep, resonant vibration of the wind's assault, a low hum that was strangely comforting. It was the sound of the earth absorbing the storm's rage. She lit a small, carefully managed fire in her stone-lined pit. It consisted of just 3 small logs, no thicker than her wrist. The smoke, thin and gray, was immediately drawn up the flue, a perfect, steady draft. Within an hour, the ambient temperature inside the dugout rose from a chilly 40 degrees to a comfortable and stable 62 degrees. She sat on her simple cot, wrapped in a blanket, and listened to the muted thunder of the world trying to tear itself apart outside. The air was still and warm. The light from her small fire danced on the smooth clay walls. She was safe. She was warm. She had been right. In the town of Providence Creek, chaos reigned. The houses, built of wood and pride, were no match for the storm's ferocity. The wind forced its way through every crack and crevice, extinguishing the warmth of their roaring, inefficient fires almost as soon as it was generated. The fine, powdery snow was driven through gaps in the window frames and under doors, accumulating in ghostly drifts inside their homes. Families huddled together, feeding their precious, rationed wood into stoves that glowed red-hot but could not beat back the encroaching, deadly cold. The temperature inside Silas Croft's well-built home, the finest in town, dropped to 20 degrees, then 10, then to the freezing point. The ink in his ledger froze solid in its well. The first day passed in a blur of terror and disbelief. The second day, December 19th, brought desperation. The wood piles, meant to last for months, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The ration plan was a joke in the face of such an onslaught. Mayor Thompson's family burned through a week's worth of wood in 12 hours, and still their breath plumed in the air of their own living room. His youngest son was developing a deep, rattling cough. In the church, Elder Finch prayed, his voice hoarse, his hands blue with cold, but the storm only intensified. The sound of splintering wood could be heard during lulls in the wind, as sheds and outbuildings were torn apart by the gale. The town was being systematically dismantled, its foundations of faith and conventional wisdom freezing and cracking under the strain. By the morning of the third day, December 20th, the situation had become a death sentence. Several families had completely exhausted their firewood. They began burning furniture, chairs, tables, the children's wooden toys, in a final, desperate bid for survival. The first death occurred shortly after dawn. An elderly man named Jedediah Morse, who succumbed to hypothermia in his own bed, his family too weak from the cold to even weep. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced the hearts of the town's leaders. They were trapped, they were freezing, and they were going to die. It was Silas Croft, a man whose mind was always on the bottom line of survival, who remembered. Through the haze of his own fear and shivering, a memory surfaced. The young widow, the foolish girl, digging a hole in the hill. He remembered his own mockery, his confident dismissal of her primitive idea. Primitive. The word now sounded like salvation. He staggered to Mayor Thompson's house, battling a wind that sought to rip the breath from his lungs, his face covered in a mask of frozen tears and mucus. He hammered on the door until a pale, terrified Thompson let him in. "The Vance girl," Croft rasped, his words barely audible over the storm. "Her cave. It's our only chance." The mayor, his arrogance frozen out of him, did not argue. Hope, no matter how humiliating its source, was still hope. They gathered 3 other men, the strongest left in the town, and prepared for the journey. It was a trek of only half a mile, but it might as well have been 100. They tied ropes around their waists, linking themselves together so they would not be separated in the blinding whiteout. They wrapped their faces in scarves, which froze solid within minutes. They pushed their way out into the maelstrom, a small, desperate pilgrimage of the damned seeking redemption from the prophet they had scorned. The journey was a nightmare. The wind knocked them off their feet repeatedly. The snow was so deep it was like wading through frozen quicksand. They could not see more than 2 feet in front of them, navigating by a shared, desperate memory of the landscape. After what felt like an eternity of agonizing effort, they stumbled into the base of Miller's Ridge, the slope offering a slight reprieve from the direct assault of the wind. They fumbled along its base, their gloved hands searching for any sign of her work. It was one of the younger men who found it, his foot plunging through the snow and striking something hard. It was the stone she had rolled against her door. They clawed at the snow with frozen, clumsy fingers, excavating the entrance to her dugout. They saw the heavy, insulated door and hammered on it with what little strength they had left. The sound was dull, absorbed by the snow and the earth. For a terrible moment, they thought she might be dead inside, or that she would refuse them entry, leaving them to the fate they had so smugly predicted for her. They hammered again, shouting her name, their voices thin and pathetic against the storm's roar. Then, the door creaked open. A wave of warm, still air, smelling faintly of wood smoke and baked bread, washed over their frozen faces. It was a scent from another world, a world of life and comfort. Ilara Vance stood there, silhouetted by the soft glow of her fire. She was not shivering. Her cheeks were flush with warmth, not frostbite. She wore a simple wool dress, no shawl, no heavy coat. She looked at the 5 men, their faces masks of ice, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe, shame, and desperate pleading. She simply stood aside. "Come in," she said, her voice calm and even. "Close the door behind you." They stumbled inside, one after another, into the impossible warmth. The transition was so abrupt it was disorienting. Outside was a world of lethal, screaming chaos. Inside was a haven of profound peace. The temperature was, as she knew, a steady 62 degrees. The men, near collapse, huddled near the small, efficient fire, their frozen clothes beginning to steam. Mayor Thompson, the man who had called her plan a folly, could only stare at the smooth clay walls, the ingenious cold sink at his feet, the steady, smokeless draw of the flue. He was witnessing a miracle not of faith, but of physics. He was inside a structure that worked, that obeyed the laws of nature, while his own expensive, prideful house was actively trying to kill him. Ilara said nothing of their previous encounter. There was no "I told you so," no recrimination in her eyes. There was only a quiet, methodical compassion. She gave them water. She took a small loaf of bread that had been baking near the fire and broke it among them. It was the most delicious thing any of them had ever tasted. For the next 24 hours, as the great blizzard reached its peak and finally began to subside, Ilara's dugout became an ark. The men, in shifts, guided the remaining townsfolk from their freezing homes to the sanctuary she had built. 48 people, men, women, and children, found refuge in the 16 by 12-foot space. It was crowded, but it was warm, and it was alive. They huddled together in the dim, steady warmth, listening to the storm spend its final fury, their lives held safely in the embrace of the earth, and in the hands of the young woman they had ridiculed. When the storm finally broke on the morning of December 22nd, the world outside was unrecognizable. It was a landscape of alien beauty and profound devastation. Snowdrifts 20 feet high had buried fences and reshaped the very contours of the land. The sun shone from a brilliant blue sky onto a world scoured clean and silent. When the survivors emerged from the dugout, blinking in the bright light, they saw the wreckage of their town. Roofs had collapsed, walls had been breached, and from 3 of the homes, no one had emerged. 9 people, including Elder Finch and the elderly Jedediah Morse, had perished in the cold, victims not of the storm, but of the stubborn refusal to heed a warning. The somber reality of the cost of their pride settled upon the survivors, a chill deeper than the blizzard itself. In the weeks and months that followed, Alara Vance was no longer an outcast. The Vance Dugout, as it came to be known, became the blueprint for the town's survival and its rebirth. The men who had mocked her, Mayor Thompson, Silas Croft, and the others, now came to her not with condescension, but with a deep and humbled reverence. They asked for her guidance, for her to share the forgotten knowledge her grandfather had passed down. She taught them how to select a site, how to read the land, how to dig and shore and ventilate. That spring, the sound of pickaxe and shovel echoed across Miller's Ridge as the people of Providence Creek, working together, built a series of new, semi-subterranean homes, each one a testament to their hard-learned lesson. Alara never married again. She remained in her dugout, which she expanded over the years, adding rooms and even a small greenhouse window in the south-facing wall. She became the quiet matriarch of the town, a living repository of the wisdom that had saved them. Her vindication was not loud or boastful. It was as quiet and profound as the warmth held within the earth. It was written in the faces of the children who would survive future winters, in the smoke rising from the flues of the hillside homes, and in the respectful silence of the men who, whenever they spoke of the Great White Death of '76, would always end the story with the same simple, reverent words. She was right. She was right all along.